Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to the Peony Project. And today's episode, we're focusing on rape and harassment. And we have the wonderful Professor Amanda here. How are you, Amanda?
I'm well, and you?
Good, thank you. Can you please tell us a bit about yourself?
I'm a professor of political science at Stellenbosch University, and I have a research chair funded by the National Research Foundation in gender politics. So my research interests are on women and citizenship, women's representation in government, and policy issues like gender-based violence, for example.
Okay, that's really interesting. So obviously it's Women's Month, and so one of the most important topic regarding women is rape and harassment, because if we look at the statistics, we see that 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of rape and harassment. So obviously it's a reality that many women face. And so we're obviously very glad to have you on the podcast because you have a different perspective, but also you have an educated insight that I think could really help us moving forward. So do you believe there's a certain line for a person to cross in which flirting or courting can be seen as harassment?
Yes, well, we need to understand that harassment is a spectrum of behavior, starting with, for example, verbal harassment, making jokes or remarks, whistling at women, then also inappropriate touching, kissing, fondling, and moving into what can be called more extreme forms of harassment like sexual assault and rape. So it's a whole spectrum of behavior. And I think women sometimes experiences that they cannot make sense whether a comment or a compliment or a way of flirting is harassment. Now, I have been chair of the Sexual Harassment Advisory Committee at Stellenbosch University for more than 20 years. And the rule of thumb that we use is that if something makes you uncomfortable, it is probably behavior that is not really innocent. So we tell students that, if they feel uncomfortable, they should tell the person who is doing this that they're not comfortable. Now, that's not always possible because it may be somebody in a relationship of power and they may feel victimization. But the rule of thumb is that if something makes you feel uncomfortable, it is probably not just innocent flirting.
Okay, so do you think it would be possible for us to, for example, make a poster that says this is harassment and this is not harassment? Or do you think it's more blurred than that? Because sometimes we could give a scenario where a man could be flirting with a woman and he doesn't understand what no means, or he doesn't know when to stop and he goes overboard. How do we define those lines? Because those lines can get very blurry, and often, I'm obviously not making an excuse, but I think often men aren't educated in understanding that enough is enough.
Yeah, you're completely correct, because that line is very blurry and it is very complicated because human sexual interaction is complicated. What I may experience as flirting, somebody else may not. So I think that there is what is necessary is that we define it like putting it in a poster, but what we need to do is to make men understand that no means no. And that all women will respond in the same way to attention. But I think this issue of when something becomes repeated behavior, that is unacceptable. And in my experience over years, people who sexually harass are repeat offenders. So they will go from one woman to the next. And unless we check that behavior, unless we say to them that this is not acceptable, it will not stop. And unfortunately, this puts the obligation on the shoulders of women to say this is not acceptable. And I think it's necessary that men also speak to other men. Men observe this behavior from other men and they say nothing. Sometimes they laugh about it. And this is, this is not innocent, this is not funny. So we need also for men to carry part of this burden, because it is men's behavior that we're talking about here. We're not talking about women's behavior. I mean, in my career, I've had only a few cases where women were harassing men or other women, but it's 99% of the behavior comes from men.
Yeah, agreed. We actually we filmed my colleague and I we filmed the podcast last week about our personal experiences with sexual harassment, and it was quite sad because together we were able to talk about 10, over 10 stories, over 10 personal stories of harassment that we've experienced, from men making jokes of sparking our drinks to, men taking our shirts off without our consent, to touching us, to, any of that kind of thing. And that was just our stories. Then we started getting into other people's stories who who had given us consent to share their stories. And it's just barbaric, it's wild how there's just so much harassment that goes on and very little consequences for this harassment.
Well, this is the thing, and I think we need to also look at what the advertising industry does in terms of the objectification of women. So this type of behavior is widely used in advertising, and I do work a rape culture workshop, and I specifically use the work of Dolce & Gabbana. Now, if people who watch this podcast want to look at it, it is blatant objectification and I would say misogyny, which means woman hating in those advertisements. So they advertise perf, or they advertise those, but the subtext is that women's bodies are there to be misused. And this, of course, then has the impact, and it's not only like advertising in the electronic media. It's also advertising, for example, around my campus. We have Stellies, the store that sells T-shirts and things, and I mean the blatant stigmatization of women's bodies in those advertising material is unacceptable. And yet this is what happens all the time. So combined with, I think very often you say you drink for spike. So where women go to clubs and gather, and where you are consuming alcohol. This seems to be a ticket for men to also think that women's bodies are there to be touched and without their consent. So we live in a society that's objectifying women's bodies, and I think the harassment has just become more and more blatant. That just think that they can get away with this type of behavior. And in a society where rape culture is so prevalent as our society, where we see the consequences of rape culture, the very high rape statistics of the highest in the world, that also escalates into femicide. We have our femicide statistic is 5 times higher than the global average. So yes, so that is the case. And we've just seen this now again with this very, very brutal murder of the student at Fort Hare. So we cannot condone the objectification of women's bodies. But again, it becomes our responsibility. And unless, more people become involved to push back against this, it's going to be a very uphill battle, like we've seen for the last decade, that we make very little progress.
Yes, yeah. So obviously, in order to really understand why we are where we are, could you briefly explain what events do you think in history went down or happened that have resulted to us being in the situation that we are now with regards to the treatment of women?
Well, I think I've just tried to explain that through the objectification. But I think there's also a far greater exposure to pornography that there has been in the past. And pornography is not about sexual intimacy. It is about the use of women's bodies. So we need to also understand that that watching pornography is pernicious in terms of how it contributes to the objectification of women's bodies. I think that what also contributes is that women have become more independent, right? They, in the past, men perceived themselves as the protectors of women, but women don't want men to be the protectors. It's that very typical role division. So women are independent, women do their own thing, women enter the labor market. There are more women students on the undergrad level on my campus than there are men. So men's measures of masculinity has changed. And there are many men that also feel that they need to put independent women in their place. So controlling sexual behavior, controlling sexuality, policing women's sexuality, and buying into rape myths. Now, these rape myths are the ones who say, well, when a woman gets raped, what were you wearing? Why were you drinking? Why were you out late at night? We ask that of men, right? So that is the policing of women's behavior and putting the blame on women. And then when there is a court case, so the criminal justice system is also complicit, those rape myths are rehearsed. And then the secondary victimization that women experience in a rape trial is horrendous. And we can just take the Zuma rape trial with Kwesi. All the that was said about Kwesi, that she's a serial rape accuser, that she doesn't understand the difference between consent and non-consent, that she's a bit crazy. So we see that even the criminal justice system fail women in many cases. That's why we, are supposed to have, and we do have sexual offences courts, but we do not have enough because of all the rape cases that get reported. So we're talking here, last year it was over 40,000. Only 14% go to trial, and only in 7% of those cases is there a conviction. And those convictions very often, are of such a nature that the person who is the perpetrator is out on the streets after a short period of time. So we have a lot of factors that combine to create a context of rape culture. And the fact that I think rape is not viewed as serious. We've heard judges or prosecutors and defense attorneys say, well, it couldn't have been so bad. You were not seriously injured. But if we look at the psychological consequences of rape, is that it destroys women's understanding of their own being in the world. It destroys their trust in other people. It destroys what makes them the person that they used to be. And that's why we see the very high levels of very serious depression after rape. So this is not something that's just, you were not very seriously injured. Why didn't you just enjoy it type of thing? It's very, very serious.
It is very serious. And it also undermines and it invalidates the painful experience of the victim or the survivor. And it also puts the blame on the victim. And so they actually never get any help. So my next question now is, what do you think is the biggest influence as to why people rape in general? And we've seen cases of rapists where they have been raped, they've experienced extreme poverty, they've come from either very sheltered homes or very wealthy homes. Do you think there is a connection, and can we understand psychologically why people rape, and also why men rape? Because obviously it seems to be that the statistics it's significantly higher that men rape women. So why is that? Is there any background or information we can understand as to why this happens?
Well, there are many theories, and you know, if we take them all together, then of course we get a better picture, but not what single theory can explain. So there's, for example, the argument that South Africa is a violent society because we come from a violent background, colonialism, apartheid, the liberation struggle, and so on. Yeah, so it's the violent background, but then we need to also ask the question, why are women not violent if we all come from a violent background, right? There's the emasculation theory that men have been so emasculated by apartheid and through process of colonialism that, you know, they're trying to claim back their manhood through rape. Well, you know, that's not a very valid argument, because it's not women that emasculated them. These are systems that emasculated them. So women then become the victims of that. Poverty, inequality, all of that, of course, contribute. But I think one of the theories that's quite valid is the fact that the women have now got more rights. So it is the police and putting women in their place, especially through violence, but also through rape. And then men's entitlement. Men think that they're entitled to sex. And we have to understand that rape is not about sex and sexual desire. It is about power. But we cannot disconnect it from the sex, because it goes hand in hand. So even though it is about power, it destroys women's sexual identity. So it's very complicated. And I don't think it's, you know, for every man, it may be a unique reason why he rapes. The point is, why is it that men are so entitled to think that they can abuse women's bodies that way? I mean, and I really think that men who do not understand the first thing about sexual intimacy, because intimacy can only happen relationally, right? So there is a relationship, there is giving and caring for each other in a very intimate relationship. And what we see with rape, it's anything but then. So I think, for example, students, male students who rape women students, that's not about a relationship. That is not about intimacy. This is about, you know, either proving my prowess and bragging about it afterwards, or things like that, which is, you know, I think that is why, you know, men struggle to have good, intimate relationships.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And I think that gives us a lot of perspective as to what's going on. So now looking at the lens of South Africa, in a place like South Africa, there's a lot of gender-based violence, and it's largely out of control. And we've seen a huge amount of gender-based violence, especially during lockdown. But it's always been very not relevant, but, you know, kind of very in our face. And my question to you is, what actions would you personally like to see that could take place that could ensure the protection of women against criminals, because they are largely not protected, especially in South Africa with regards to gender-based violence and marital rape? Even though marital rape has recently become illegal, we still don't see enough protection for women.
Well, you know, I think, and I mean, this is the thing about sexual violence, is that if you want to police, you have to know where it happens, right? And so much of this happens in private spaces. So it's difficult to actually control it. But I think I am opposed to a carceral state, right? So a carceral state is where, you know, perpetrators get incarcerated. And I mean, there's this whole notion that rapists should rot in jail, but that doesn't help, because that is reactive, right? You can only deal with perpetrators after the fact. So the damage has already been done. So I think what we need is proactive, preventative work. And this has to happen on the level of the socialization of norms. So we have to start with children. And what children get in sexual orientation in schools is not that, right? It tells them about the mechanics of sexual intercourse, but it doesn't tell them about the broader context of what is intimacy, what is respect for others, respect for other people's bodies, and so on. we need to, and a lot of what we see here is connected to very outdated social roles, right? So men are the providers and the protectors, and women, have to be supportive, and they need to accept men's protection. And we know that we see here that men are not our protectors at all. So those are outdated social roles. The point is that we need to make people understand that these roles have changed, and that your men's masculinity cannot be vested in the fact that they are, sexually the studs, right? That they are actually the ones who do the conquering of women, and then that's how you establish your manhood, your masculinity. That is a very outdated idea, and it's never actually worked for women. So we need to change the way we think about the roles that men and women have in society, and how, when you talk about gender equality, you have to think that these roles have to are not contributing to gender equality. Gender equality has got to do with not necessarily that everybody has the same roles, but that all people contribute in a way to society, and that there needs to be an understanding of that contribution and how that relates to relationships between men and women. Yeah. If men only think that they can keep women in their place through violence and clinging to, because here we have a situation where men feel socially marginalized and excluded, and their masculinity limited. Unless we also work on the bigger issue of reducing poverty, of giving people at least human dignity in how they live, and not be socially marginalized and excluded, we're not going to see a change in this. And I mean, this is the huge tragedy of South Africa, is the inequality, the poverty, and the unemployment, because men's pathways to masculinity has been blocked in many ways, and women now have to take blame for that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think that's a very valid point. And now I know that you have answered it previously, but just going back to this, because I think it's a really important question. Why do you think victims are always to blame? As I said, I know that you had explained it before, but what could be the exact reasons, and how can we combat this? How can we prevent the victims from being blamed? Because it's obviously not their fault, and if they're continually blamed, it means they don't get the necessary psychological support that they need.
Yes, well, blaming the victim is always easier in patriarchal societies, right? Because who talk about relationships of power, then men always are, well, in most cases, are in power. So how women's sexuality has been described in patriarchal societies is that they are the ones who seduce men. They are the ones who have to then take the blame for what happened to them. And that's the whole issue that I mentioned already about the rape myths, right? What were you wearing, and why were you in a certain place at a certain time? So the blame always shifts to women, because they are supposed to be the ones who actually are the ones who seduce men. The focus is on women, and not on what men do, but on what women do. And this is part of how patriarchal societies invest in power relationships between men and women, and how women then becomes the ones who are blamed. And we see this, as I've said, that dismissiveness of women's experiences in court cases as well, is because the law is also patriarchal, right? The law looks at the world from a man's perspective, and it then, does not take into consideration women's perspective. And I mean, this is also this notion of no actually means yes, because women have to play this game, you know, be coy and then later on be available. So again, it comes back to how in patriarchal societies, women's sexuality is being constructed, and how it then feeds into these all kinds of rape myths that really gets accepted by men. Unless men are told that these are myths, you know, then they do continue to think that this is how the world works.
Yeah, for sure. And then I have a question. So I know this is a slightly controversial question, but we actually we conducted a survey, and one of the last questions on the survey we asked, do you think it's necessary for women to put in measures to prevent that they're raped? And so my question is, do you think that sometimes asking a woman, or the thought of like, where was she, you know, what was she wearing, do you think it's justified? And do you think it's up to us as women to ensure our protection?
No, because what that does is it leads to us policing ourselves. And I've also done a survey where I've asked questions. And then, you know, I've asked students, for example, male and female students, when you go out at night, what do you do? What do you think about before you go out of the door? And women will say, you know, I will make sure that I have my pepper spray, that I, you know, are dressed in a way that's you know, not inviting any type of attention, that I, you know, or I will get my friends to walk with me. So you know, protecting ourselves. The men say, I take my keys and I go. So you see that women have to think about their own security, but they also have to police their own behavior, right? So if somebody wants to wear a very short pants, right? You think about that. You think about what's the consequences going to be if I wear these pants. And this is about the way society operates, is that men polices women's sexuality, but then women start to police their own sexuality because they fear the consequences. And any society that is, you know, where everybody is, you know, men and women are equal, but women also have agency and independence, she should be able to wear whatever she likes. But it's not possible in the type of society in which we live. And it's not only ours, it's everywhere.
Everyone's, yeah, that's very true.
And many others. Yeah.
So I just want to quickly look at the survey. And so I'm just going to quickly go over some of the questions we asked. So it was quite scary. The one question we asked was, do you personally know of anyone who's been sexually assaulted or raped? And 90% said that they did know of someone who was sexually assaulted and raped. And then 19% said that they did not feel that the perpetrator got the punishment that they wanted. Now, another question that we asked, which I thought was quite concerning, looking at the answers, the question was, do you believe that there's a difference between rape and sexual assault? And 62.5% said yes. That's obviously a problem, because it means that if you see that there's a difference between rape and sexual assault, it means one's going to be taken less seriously. Where do you think this problem originates, and how can we try and combat this issue?
Well, in law, there is a difference between sexual assault and rape, right? Because, and that's about the definition of rape, that is penetration of the vagina. Now sexual assault often is not penetration. It's other forms of touching, or you know, putting fingers in other orifices. So it is different, but it all amounts to a very serious violation of women's bodies. And I think you are right. And when people say there is a difference, they think that the one is less serious than the other. That's why I talk about that spectrum of sexual behavior, of sexual harassment. I never say the one is more serious than the other, because they are all serious, but some is just more extreme than others. And that sort of physical violation of the body is on the one end of the spectrum. But I mean, that is very serious, and you know, I think there's that margin or boundary between sexual assault and rape is a very narrow one, and in my mind, they all comes down to a very serious violation of women's bodies.
Of course. And then with question number 10, so I think I sent you the survey, but the question was, select the following situations where you think rape of a female is more likely. 95% said that the female was drunk, and that's when she would be raped. 20% said that the female was sober. 75% said that the female was showing cleavage. 82% said that the female was at a party, and 45% that said that the female was in the comfort of her own home. Do you think that this is accurate to what actually happens in, versus people's perceptions of situations in which women could be sexually assaulted or raped?
Well, I mean, those are all places that it could happen, but when we look at the South African context, it can happen anywhere. We know that stranger rape, women get 85% of rape cases, more or less. The perpetrator is known to women. But then there are the others, stranger rape. So we know women may walk down the street and she may be grabbed. So it's not only that it happens in her home or his home. It can happen anywhere. But the point is that in the majority of cases, the perpetrator is known. So it may also be somebody that the victim trusts. And so this is what makes rape such a very difficult thing to deal with, because in the end, there are no witnesses, and it becomes he said, she said. The immediate question, for example, if this happens in the home of the perpetrator, the question will be, what were you doing in his home, right? It won't be, why did you rape somebody who was in your home? The question would be, why were you in his home?
Yeah, so the blame again is then shifted onto the victim. And so then we also asked questions in the survey. We conducted the same questions, but with men. And the question was, select the following situations where you think rape of a male was most likely. And they all, 87.5% said if the male was drunk. And 75% said that the male could not have prevented the rape, while 25% said that the male could have prevented the rape, which I think is slightly unfair, because the same kind of viewpoint was not given towards women. You know, it was kind of like the onus or the blame was put on her.
Are we talking? I'm not sure I understood correctly. Are you saying that we're talking here about male rape, or are we talking here about men saying things about that it could have been prevented?
So men being raped. So in our survey, it said that if a man was raped, so obviously we were comparing the perception of female and male rape to see how equal it was. And in the survey, it said 87.5% believe that if a male were to be raped, it would be under the circumstances that he was drunk. And then we asked the question, do you believe that a male could have prevented being raped or sexually assaulted if he had changed his actions? And 75% said no, while 25% said yes. So what I'm saying is that this shows a flaw within society, because the same pardon was not given to women within the survey.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think this issue of being raped while you're drunk, whether it's male rape or female rape, is that shouldn't be, it's always used as mitigating circumstances, but it should be, actually make it worse, because why would you rape somebody who is basically unconscious, right? Is that about? Why do you spike a woman's drink so that she is unconscious? it's all about power, dominance, and entitlement. And the same, I mean, whether it's a man or a woman who gets raped, this whole issue of alcohol abuse. And I think in the 2016 hashtag End Rape Culture, women made that very clear, that drinking alcohol is not a crime, but rape is a crime.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's also a very difficult conversation to have around alcohol use and abuse is also, why consume, and now I'm talking about just people in general, right? Consume so much alcohol that you end up in a situation where you cannot remember anything.
Mm.
So we need to also think about how we manage the use of alcohol, right? And I'm not saying that, like drinking should be a crime, but I'm saying that alcohol becomes a huge risk factor in how people behave towards each other, and it increases men's sense of entitlement. And I think, when inhibitions go because of alcohol use, a lot of things go wrong. And the problem with that is that, and I've dealt with cases like this, is that the survivor of the rape cannot remember much. So how do you then deal with a case where you don't know really what happened? And of course, if there's been rape, then somebody was actually using the body of someone else. And of course, that is just really a serious criminal offense. But in a court case, it's not going to stand up, because this argument will be made that, you were both drunk. I don't know if you remember the Brock Turner case in America.
Yes.
So Brock Turner, a very good athlete, and then one night, a woman student was, I think her drink was spiked. So he had sex with her in an alley. Well, I mean, he was raping her because she was unconscious, but then there were witnesses. So there was a court case. And in the end, he got a slap on the wrist because, I mean, he was a good scholar, he was a good athlete, and what will a rape conviction do to his career, blah, blah, blah. The point is, nobody looked at what happened to her. And I mean, if you look at, there's a body of literature that analyzes the Brock Turner case, that she is the one now carrying the shame and the blame and everything else. So it's that thing that, alcohol give men even more entitlement, and you end up in situations that I mean, it's a risk factor that makes women just more vulnerable.
Yeah, of course. I remember when I saw that case, it made me incredibly angry, because as you said, he got a slap on the wrist, and she now has to deal with the fact that he's gotten away with everything. But not only that, it means that other women out there could become potential victims, which obviously doesn't leave a very safe world for women. But my next question is regarding the concept of no. So I personally believe, but I could be wrong, I personally believe that no isn't just the word no. It could be if there's hesitance, it could be if someone ignores you, it could mean the actual word no. What is your perception on that? And do you think a woman needs to outright say no in order for a man to know he must back off, even if she looks hesitant, even if she purposely ignores him, etc., etc.?
Well, I think this is the issue about consent, right? Now, if we look at the law wants us to consent verbally. So you've said no. But we know that when women get raped, they freeze, their body just goes numb, they don't do anything, they don't say no. I mean, this was a big issue in the Zuma rape trial, right? Because the question was, why didn't you scream? His bodyguards was probably just outside the door, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Is that, so to verbalize no is not always possible. And we know that very often women who, get socialized in a way that you are nice to people. So if you in a situation where somebody is, flirting with you, you try to sort of make a clear through your body language that you're not interested, but the flirting and the coercion doesn't stop. So no has to be verbalized. But I think there's also a fear on women's side is that when you say no, that you will be victimized, right? So now you're a bitch. And men will then, of course, act in a way that's going to victimize you. So women are always trapped between a rock and a hard place. If you're trying to be nice, it could be interpreted in the wrong way. If you're not nice and you're very straightforward and you verbalize the no, you turn into a bitch, and then you get different type of behavior. So it's a very difficult situation.
That actually brings me on to my next question. So my colleague actually in our last podcast, she was talking about a time where she was at a party and one of her friends had been dared to take my colleague's shirt off, and her shirt had been taken off without her consent, and she got incredibly angry. And she lectured them and she was like, you have no right to do that. And all the people in the room, I think it was like one male or something like that, and the rest were women. And so a similar situation with me, I was once at a bar and I've had my drink spiked before, so I cover my drink with my hand every time. And one of these guys who was there said to me, why are you covering your drink? And I said, I'm covering it because I don't want my drink to be spiked. And then he made a joke and he said, oh, well, maybe I'll just spike your drink and rape you. And I got incredibly angry and I was like, you cannot say that. And all my female friends looked at me as if I was crazy and overreacting. And the same thing with my colleague. All her female friends looked at her as if she was overreacting. So we see that almost this brainwashed sentimentality of like an as to how women view other women protecting themselves. These women are kind of seen almost as barbaric or crazy or overreacting. And we see that this kind of very toxic patriarchal behavior is actually starting to come up in women. I mean, there was an ex-friend of mine who was raped as well, and her friends at that time had asked her what she was wearing if she was drunk. So we see that this behavior is now embedded into women. Why do you think that is the case? And to what degree is it problematic?
I mean, this is the thing about patriarchal societies, is that women internalize those ideas, right? So those ideas are the type of ideas that measure themselves against the norms of a patriarchal culture. The problem here is that if you let it slide and you don't push back, and I mean what you and your friend did was the right thing to do, is that men thinks it's normal to say that type of thing. And I think the question we have to ask here is, would anyone in that group have made a racist joke, right? We have come to understand that the racist jokes are not acceptable. So why is it okay to make sexist and misogynist jokes? And this is the thing, that if we don't push back against it, and in a certain way, that men understand that what they do and say is not acceptable, it's not going to stop. And then women become complicit in that behavior.
Yeah, that's very true. And then I have a question, which I remember you said I should ask last. If we can agree that the best way to prevent rape is to teach potential rapists not to, what is the best way to go about it? And at what age should we teach people about rape, and how exactly can a rapist's mind be changed on the matter?
Well, the reason why I say I'm uncomfortable with the question is that, a rapist, we don't know who a rapist is. We cannot call all men rapists, but all have the potential to rape. So what you're asking is that, when do children, boys and girls, become aware of their sexuality and, inappropriate touching and fondling? And there is a thing like childhood sexuality, right? Children are sexual beings. And so that has to be managed as well. Now, I think, again, what I'm saying here is that socialization plays a very important role in making kids think about bodies and what is respect for somebody else's body and what is inappropriate touching. I mean, this is why at a very small age, we teach little girls where people can touch you and cannot touch you, to make them understand that there is some type of touching that's inappropriate, because we know about incest and we know about, you know, uncles and stepfathers and all kinds of people touching girls inappropriately. But we also need to tell boys that, you know, you don't, their own body shouldn't be touched in a certain way, but you also don't touch girls' bodies in a certain way. And that then, you know, needs to be reinforced by the school curriculum. We need to make kids understand what is healthy sexuality, what is healthy intimacy, versus what is that very serious violation of a person's body. And, you know, we cannot use the societal norms in a country that is so steeped in sexual violence anymore as to think that, you know, my child is going to be okay out there, because out there the teachers are the rapists, right? I mean, how many teachers have not raped girls? So we have to teach them from the start. But I would be very careful not to talk about toxic masculinity, because we cannot stigmatize every man's masculinity. Not all men have toxic masculinity. So we need to think about, and this is what I'm saying about prevention, right? That how are we going to raise a generation of kids who will think about sex and sexuality differently? And this is going to be really hard if society is reinforcing rape culture. So like I said, the advertising industry, the way we talk about women's bodies, what we see in places that sort of sexualize women's bodies. It's hard when you are surrounded by that. And that is why, you know, I think globally, there needs to be a greater pushback. And #MeToo was that pushback, right? It was a pushback to say, we have been brutalized in the workplace for long enough. So we now need to also move away from just thinking about the workplace, but thinking about other spaces, and spaces specifically that involve students and young kids. And so there's an obligation on parents, there's an obligation on teachers, there's an obligation on the peer group. I think, you know, we need to actually also talk to men about this notion of entitlement. You know, the femicide is so high because men don't get what they want. If they can't get what they want, then I'll just kill you. Now, you know, and it is, you know, it boggles the mind that people would go to that extreme, show their dissatisfaction with women's behavior. And I think, you know, we need in this country that conversation, that conversation about why men feel so entitled, and why it is that this war is being fought on the bodies of women.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This was really educational. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people watching this would have learned a lot. It's quite sad that we have to be having these conversations, but it's a reality for a lot of women. And yeah, Amanda, thank you so much for taking your time to come on here and chat to us about this. Do you have any hope for South Africa? Do you think there's a potential that we can move forward? Do you think we're moving positively in any way?
Well, I think the COVID pandemic is, of course, deepened our troubles, the poverty, the inequality, and all of that, like I've said, also form a backdrop for the violence. But, you know, I've lived in this country all my life, and I have seen how we can actually overcome amazing hurdles if we work together. So I think what is needed here is working together. And for that, we need good leadership. So I hope that we will get good leadership to create a context for all these different types of conversations we need to have around sexual violence.
Yeah, Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. This is amazing. We're so lucky and privileged to have someone like you with the amount of knowledge that you have to come on here. And yeah, I really hope this helps a bunch of people. So thank you so much. Alrighty.
You're welcome. My pleasure.